Good morning. Chapter 15 of the Ribhu Gita. The means for the conquest of the mind. Verse 1. Listen, I shall tell you further about the Supreme, that instantly bestows the supreme liberation. All ever is of the nature of Brahman. All is of the nature of the peaceful Brahman. Rare sage, whatever is seen as the world, is of the nature of the undivided, perfectly full Brahman. There's never a thing apart. Whatever is seen as fragmented is of the nature of Brahman. 2. Whatever functions in whichever way is also of the nature of Brahman. Whatever is thought of in whichever way is also of the nature of Brahman. The injunctions of the Vedas are also of the nature of Brahman. The aphorisms of Vedanta are of the nature of Brahman. The wonderful precepts of the Guru are also of the nature of Brahman. The infinitely great Mahavakyas are also of the nature of Brahman. Yoga is of the nature of Brahman. Knowledge is also of the nature of Brahman. 3. Speaking without affection is of the nature of Brahman. Speaking amicably is also of the nature of Brahman. Listening is of the nature of Brahman. Thinking is also of the nature of Brahman. Unperturbed meditation also is of the nature of Brahman. Steadfast samadhi is of the nature of Brahman. Strong certitude is also of the nature of Brahman. Deep faith is also of the nature of Brahman. 4. The exhortation of the Guru is of the nature of Brahman. Offering obeisance to the Guru is of the nature of Brahman. The various means are also of the nature of Brahman. The pursued ends are also of the nature of Brahman. All things that are seen are of the nature of Brahman. The seer is also of the nature of Brahman. All ever is of the nature of Brahman. The world, the individuals, and the Supreme are all of the nature of Brahman. 5. As anything seen as apart from Brahman will only produce sorrow, inducing fear. The contemplation that all that is seen is only the seer, that is Brahman, and then proceeding to cast off even that thought of all being Brahman, and then being lost in silent meditation in the void, will confer unsurpassed bliss and rid oneself of fear. Because of this certitude, turn your attention to abidance in meditation. 6. Setting aside all and becoming devoid is the renunciation of all. By all is meant only the mind. Casting off the mind is the renunciation of all. The renunciation of the faulty mind is the renunciation of the ego and all such. There's also the renunciation of all the world, the individuals and the Supreme. Nigraga, that will give you unsurpassed, wonderful bliss. 7. It is the renunciation of the mind that is the great success. It is the renunciation of the mind that is the great achievement. It is the renunciation of the mind that is the great joy. It is the renunciation of the mind that is the great yoga. It is the renunciation of the mind that is the great knowledge. It is the renunciation of the mind that is the great liberation. It is the renunciation of the mind that is the renunciation of all. It is the renunciation of the mind that is the renunciation of thought. 8. It is thought that is the great delusion. It is thought that is the body and senses and life. It is thought that is the world and beings. It is thought that is worldly bondage. It is thought that is the Vedas and scriptures. It is thought that is inquiry and all others. It is thought that is good and bad qualities. It is thought that is sentience and insentience. 9. It is thought that is a great sin. It is thought that is a great blemish. It is thought that is a great disputant. It is thought that is a great disease. It is thought that is the great fear. It is thought that is the great bondage. It is thought that produces all anxiety. It is thought that appears as all. 10. When thought is not there, there is not in the least the world and its beings. If it is there, they are there. Therefore, son, it is thought that is the individual and the supreme and the world. One must conquer thought by any possible means. The conquest of thought is the unparalleled victory. If you want to ask what is the means of conquering this loathsome thought, now hear this. 11. There is never such a thing as thought at all. There's only the Supreme Brahman, which is all consciousness, established as eternal and perfectly full. This permanent certitude is the unfailing means, son, for victory over thought. By this, destruction of the mind will truly result. If that results, all will shine as consciousness. 12. If we think for a moment that there is such a thing as thought, consciousness itself will appear as thought. That itself will appear as the world and jivas and the Supreme. There will be misery arising out of it. Therefore, conquer thought easily by the certitude that there is no such thing as thought, and all is consciousness, and thereby attain bliss. 13. Conquest of thought alone is the great success. Conquest of thought alone is the great achievement. Conquest of thought alone is the great yoga. Conquest of thought alone is the great knowledge. Conquest of thought alone is the great purification. Conquest of thought alone is great liberation. Conquest of thought alone is the removal of sorrow. And conquest of thought alone is the greatest happiness. 14. The conquest of thought is itself the renunciation of thought. The renunciation of thought is of the nature of consciousness. Your true nature, son, is consciousness. Thought and others are also of the nature of consciousness. Truly, all is of the nature of consciousness. By the certitude that I am ever of the nature of that consciousness, you shall easily overcome thought and attain happiness. 15. I am ever that thing, Brahman, which is consciousness. Thought and such so described are also that I, consciousness. There's not an atom apart from me. Whatever is seen as manifold is only I, the Supreme. I am of the nature of the perfectly full. I am of the nature that's imperishable. I am of the nature that's ever one. By this unfailing certitude, achieve conquest of thought. 16. I'm ever devoid of the elements. I'm ever devoid of what is composed of the elements. I'm ever devoid of the body and such. I'm ever devoid of any conditionings. I'm ever the ancient. I'm ever the perfectly full knowledge. I'm ever the supreme Brahman. By this unfailing certitude, achieve conquest of thought. 17. There is not an atom apart from the space of consciousness. What is consciousness space is itself all. You are the supreme Brahman, which is consciousness space. Anyone is the supreme Brahman, which is consciousness space. All is the supreme Brahman, which is consciousness space. By the certitude that I am consciousness space, achieve conquest of thought, and be ever established as consciousness space. 18. What is consciousness space will remain actionless. What is consciousness space is all pervasive. What is consciousness space is thought. What is consciousness space is also mind. There's not an atom apart from consciousness space. Consciousness space itself is all. By the certitude that I am consciousness space, achieve conquest of thought, and be ever established as consciousness. 19. Consciousness space itself is all people. Consciousness space itself is all gods. Consciousness space itself is Brahman. Consciousness space itself is Hari. Consciousness space itself is Hara. Consciousness space itself is Shiva himself. Having the certitude that I am that consciousness space, achieve conquest of thought, and be ever established as consciousness. 20. If you ask, what is consciousness space? It is the consciousness that's everywhere without any symbol or characteristic. Consciousness space itself is all the individuals. Consciousness space itself is all the worlds. Consciousness space itself is the Lord, Ishvara. Consciousness space itself is all. By the certitude that I am consciousness space, conquer thought and be ever established as consciousness. 21. I'm only of the nature of the mass of existence, consciousness, bliss. I'm only of the nature of the permanent absolute. I'm only of the nature of the ever sheathless. I'm only of the nature of the unsurpassed mass of bliss. I'm only of the nature of the non-dual fullness. I'm only of the nature of the undivided Supreme, which is all. I am of the nature of the great Supreme Self. By this certitude, achieve conquest of thought. 22. The self indeed is all this, of this there is no doubt. The self indeed is the only existence, of this there is no doubt. The self indeed is the supreme abode, of this there is no doubt. The self indeed is the supreme reality, of this there is no doubt. The self indeed is your own nature, of this there is no doubt. The self indeed is of the nature of the supreme, of this there is no doubt. By attaining the certitude that I am the self, achieve conquest of thought. 23. The self indeed is all beings, of this there is no doubt. The self indeed is all the worlds, of this there is no doubt. The self indeed is the mind and all, of this there is no doubt. The self indeed is all the rest there is, of this there is no doubt. The self indeed is all, of this there is no doubt. The self indeed is the supreme Brahman, of this there is no doubt. By attaining the certitude that I am the self, achieve conquest of thought. 24. The self itself creates all the worlds. The self itself takes away all the worlds. The self itself destroys all the worlds. The self itself manifests as all. The self itself is the undivided, without an iota of exception. The self, indeed, is of the nature of the non-dual. By attaining the certitude that I am the self, achieve conquest of thought. 25. The self alone is the guru of the self. The self alone is the disciple of the self. The self alone can know the self. The self alone exists as the self. The self alone can take away the self. The self alone is the undivided fullness. By attaining the certitude that I am the self, achieve conquest of thought. 26. The self only is the mantra for the self. The self only is the japa for the self. The self only is the holy water for the self. The self only is the charity for the self. The self only is the holy shrine for the self. The self only is the fruit for the self. By attaining the certitude that the self is all, and I'm only that self, achieve conquest of thought. 27. The self alone is the listening for the self. The self alone is also the reflection for the self. The self alone is the meditation for the self. The self alone is the samadhi for the self. The self alone is the knowledge of the self. The self alone is the liberation for the self. By attaining the certitude that the self is all, and I'm only that self, achieve conquest of thought. 28. The self alone is the humans and the gods. The self alone is Brahma and Hari. The self alone is Hara and Shiva. The self alone is Uma and other feminine counterparts. The self alone is you and I. The self alone is all others. By attaining the certitude that the self is all, and I am only that self, achieve conquest of thought. 29. The self itself is the world and the jiva and the supreme. The self itself transcends all. The self itself is the imperishable truth. The self itself is the nature that is self-luminous. The self itself is eternal and pure. The self itself is the unsurpassed bliss. By attaining the certitude that the self is all, and I'm only that self, achieve conquest of thought. The self indeed is of the nature of the supreme fourth state. The self indeed transcends the fourth state. The self indeed is of the nature of the blemishless supreme. The self indeed is of the nature of the all-pervasive. The self indeed is of the nature of the indestructible. The self indeed is of the nature of the undivided supreme. By attaining the certitude that the self is all, and I'm only that self, achieve conquest of thought. 31. The self indeed is utter peace. The self indeed is also existence, consciousness, bliss. The self indeed is the undivided complete fullness. The self indeed is of the nature of non-duality. There's not an atom up here apart from the self. The self is you, the self is I, the self is all. By attaining the certitude that the self is all, and I'm only that self, achieve conquest of thought. 32. I'm eternal, I'm partless, I'm taintless, I'm blemishless, and I indeed am the complete perfect fullness. I am the truth, I am peaceful, I am ancient, I am all, I am the permanent Shambhu, Shiva, the bestower of happiness. I am also pure, I am the mass of bliss, I am free, I am subtle, and I indeed am of the nature of the self-luminous. I am the liberated, I am the liberation, and I am the liberator. I am of the nature of the delusionless, superior knowledge. (33) I am the ancient, and I am the Purush. I am the complete, I am the holy, and I am also the unblemished. I am devoid of old age and death. I am the mass of consciousness. I am mere consciousness, and I'm also of the nature of consciousness space. I am afflictionless. I am attributeless. I am eternal. I am unequaled. I am also the unsurpassed bliss. I am higher than the highest. I am the supreme Shiva. I am the supreme self. I am of the nature of the supreme Brahman. 34. I'm also the Lord. I'm also the supreme Ishvara, and I am the immaculate. I am the creator of individual being or soul, and I am also their destroyer. Sorry, I'm going to read it again. I am the creator of Pasu, individual being or soul, and Pasa, bondage, and I'm also their destroyer. I'm a mass of bliss. I'm the one who provides bliss. I'm tireless. I am of the nature of the self-born. I am all. I am the cause of all the world, and I'm also of the nature of the actionless, without anything or all. I am without ego. I am one untouched by old age or death. I'm also of the nature of the undivided and non-dual. 35. I am of the nature of the world, the individuals, and the Supreme. I am of the nature that is totally devoid of jivas and such. I am of the nature of the Supreme Brahman alone. I am of the nature of the magnificent Absolute. I am of the nature of Holy Supreme Brahman. I am of the supreme nature of consciousness space. By avidly attaining the undivided knowledge of the Supreme Brahman, you shall achieve conquest of thought. 36. There is nothing at all of the world, or the individual, or the Supreme. There is nothing at all of the world, or the individual, or the Supreme. All is of the nature of the undivided Supreme Brahman. All is of the nature of the undivided Supreme Brahman. Indeed, I am the nature of the Supreme Brahman, which is all. Indeed, I am of the nature of the Supreme Brahman, which is all. By attaining this knowledge that I am indeed the undivided Supreme Brahman, you shall achieve conquest of thought. 37. As it is only Brahman, immobile as a stone, blemishless, taintless, and all-pervasive, the true knowledge and the mass of bliss that appears as the world, individuals, and the Supreme, all ever is Brahman, and I am that complete fullness. Merged in this certitude, you shall easily achieve conquest of thought. 38. Ignorance, which is the seed of destruction, exists not. Egoity and others, which are its consequences, exist not. Delusion, which is the cause of all, exists not. There is not an atom of its effect. There are no created world and individuals in the Supreme. By the steadfast knowledge that all ever is this Supreme Brahman, and that Supreme Brahman is myself, unfailingly attain conquest of thought. Knowledge and the knowable that give joy are non-existent. The bondage that changes and liberation are non-existent. All is of the nature of the non-dual Supreme Brahman. That is the undivided consciousness space. I am of that nature that is the one, complete, perfect fullness, which is all-pervasive, peace. By attaining this undivided supreme knowledge, you shall achieve conquest of thought. 40. There is no thought. There is no thought. Consciousness is all. There is no thought. There is no thought. Consciousness is all. This is the truth. This is the truth. There's no doubt about this. I say this in the name of the feet of Shambhu, Shiva, the bestower of happiness. There is no doubt of this. I am that consciousness. I am that consciousness. Only consciousness. I am that consciousness. I am that consciousness. Consciousness is all. By having such steadfast knowledge, you shall easily attain conquest of thought. There is no delusion apart from me, and no Lord, Ishvara. There is no ignorance apart from me, and no individual, or jiva. There is no portion that trails behind or apart from me. There's no world that remains apart from me. There's nothing to be seen apart from me. There's no Supreme Brahman apart from me. There's nothing apart from me. I am all. By such certitude, you shall conquer thought. 42. There is no word as that apart from me. There is no word as you apart from me. There's no word as are apart from me. There's nothing undivided apart from me. There's nothing to be spoken of apart from me. There's nothing to be desired apart from me. There's nothing apart from me. I am all. By such certitude you shall conquer thought. 43. There's nothing as existence apart from me. There's nothing as consciousness apart from me. There's nothing as bliss apart from me. There's nothing as pure apart from me. There's nothing as jewel apart from me. There's nothing as non-jewel apart from me. There's nothing apart from me. I am all. By such certitude you shall conquer thought. 44. Whatever is seen as apart from me is illusory. Whatever is seen as apart from me is unreal. Whatever is seen as apart from me is elusive magic. Whatever is seen as apart from me is the serpent in the rope. Whatever is seen as apart from me is the son of a barren woman. Whatever is seen as apart from me is the horn of a hare. There's not an atom apart from me. I am all. By such certitude you shall conquer thought. 45. Until there is stability of the differenceless realization that Brahman is all and I'm that Brahman, you should meditate on the identity that Brahman is all. Brahman is all. I am Brahman. Brahman is all. Brahman is all. I am Brahman. When there is awareness of that identity, the changeless supreme knowledge that all is Brahman and that am I will become the natural state. Sahaj. 46. Hence, by the conviction that all is Brahman and that the undivided supreme Brahman is myself, and having a natural awareness by means of such conviction, you shall achieve conquest of thought. Also, if you achieve conquest of thought as described, there's nothing else for you to do afterward. I have told you all in the manner of what the omniscient Supreme Shiva has taught me. 47. Nidaga, whatever I've told you thus is certain. Why elaborate further? If you are always immersed, without the least exception, in the certitude I am Brahman, you shall achieve conquest of thought easily by that. You shall live attaining the indivisible Supreme Brahman bliss. I say this in the name of the gracious, completely full, perfect Shiva. There's no doubt of what has been said. What I have declared is the truth. 48. Only those who have achieved conquest of thought by the commendable conviction that all that is seen is the Supreme, and I am that one perfectly full Supreme, will become liberated. Those who have at least once listened to and understood this meaning, expounded thus by the Supreme Shiva, steadfastly with an undistracted mind, will unfailingly become themselves the Supreme Brahman. 49. By steadfastly contemplating that all that is seen as men and gods, and beasts and birds, and as various other creatures, is only the seeming appearance of the divine form of the God of gods, and only by the subtle mind suffused with sattva guna, illuminating quality, overriding the other two, rajas and tamas, agitation and inertia. Can the perfectly full nature of the Supreme Shiva be perceived? Not by any other means. 50. Hence, only those who have realized Shiva by the mode of undisturbed meditation in their subtle heart, that all that is perceived by knowledge is only the Supreme Shiva of the nature of knowledge, and that is ourselves, and that is ourselves, shall, ever conquering fear inducing thought, realize the great bliss of Brahman. Thus the sage Ribhu expounded to Nidaga the means of the conquest of thought. 51. It is the infinite form of our peerless Lord in a state of eternal dance that says, the unshakable, certain knowledge that the world and the many beings and Ishvara, perceived by thought, are only of the nature of supreme consciousness, and I am that peerless absolute, is the commendable means to attain the best of the best conquest of thought. So thank you. This is the end of chapter 15. I wish everybody a great day. Bye for now.